All right, good, we're here. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Evelien Buskers, and I will be introducing you to the S&OP Subway Map. I will also tell you a little bit about the role it can play in S&OP initiatives. And then my colleague Hans van der Drift is going to talk a bit about the essentials to keep in mind when performing S&OP improvement initiatives. So I would like to start off by having a look at this painting, this piece of art. So it might seem very easy to make because it's so simple, but that is not the case at all. And the same goes for S&OP processes. They might look very simple from the outside, but they are certainly not easy to manage or improve or implement. So whenever we want to implement or improve an S&OP process, we always start with asking ourselves why. What is the objective of the initiative? And this is because very often we see companies struggling with their S&OP process because the benefits are the objectives are not clear to them. And of course, we will not do we don't do S&OP just for the sake of S&OP itself. So before we start, we always make sure that the objectives are clearly defined. So what do we want to accomplish through our S&OP process? And we make sure that that everyone in the organization is on the same page as well. When that has been done, we continue on to the S&OP change model. So this the S&OP change model contains all the aspects that we need to consider with regard to change. So people. So there's 4 aspects to take into consideration. Let's start with the meaning. So this stems from the why. So what for individuals, what does it bring to them? What are the benefits as an organization, but also to them as individuals? Then we have the willingness. So are there people in the organization really willing to drive this forward and to take on the challenge? Then we have the logic. So this is really about the processes and tools themselves and the KPIs. So do we have the right KPIs in place, and do we have the appropriate dashboards to follow up on them? And then last, we have the ability. So do we have the right people in place, and are they properly trained? So this is very much about competencies and skills. So notice that we need all 4 of these, and also notice the result is the multiplication of these 4 aspects. So that means that not paying enough attention to one of them can have serious consequences for the initiative as a whole. And now what tends to happen is that we tend to focus very much on the logic, and maybe a little less on the soft side, so the other aspects. And this is exactly where the S&OP Subway Map can play a role. So that said, let me introduce you to the S&OP Subway Map itself. Now, it's important to note that an S&OP journey is different for every company. So what is portrayed here is just an example, and it elaborates the concept of the S&OP Subway Map, but in no way does it mean that every S&OP process should look like this. Now, we know that very often middle management and higher management have a very clear grasp of an S&OP process as a whole. But for people working in the organization on an operational level, it can be a bit more difficult to grasp the overall process. So this is how the S&OP Subway Map can help to give that overview, and also to make them aware of how everything connects to each other, and what impact their activities have on the activities elsewhere. So let's have a closer look at the S&OP Subway Map. So the lines, the metro lines, they represent the roles that are involved in this process. So we can see the roles involved in the left bottom corner. So they are product management or marketing in yellow. Orange is our sales force. Then we have several supply chain functions. Pink is demand management, green supply management. The light blue is material management. Then we have purple is production management, and our darker blue is the executive team as a whole. So let's start in the yearly zone, which is the blue zone, which means that the activities portrayed here are performed on a yearly basis. So in this case, it's all about the strategy. So every function, here we see this first big station. Every single function in this case is involved in the supply chain strategy review, which is based on the overall company strategy. Then we can move on to the purple zone, which is the quarterly zone. So on a quarterly basis, our portfolio is reviewed. And in preparation for the portfolio review, we see that there are several activities that are performed by product management or marketing. Then we can have a look at the monthly zone, which is the light green zone. So we have our demand review, our supply review, and our S&OP meeting itself. Also, again, a number of activities that are performed in preparation. And also note that when certain issues may arise during our S&OP meeting, there is the possibility to escalate them to an executive S&OP meeting for the executives to make the final call. And finally, there is the weekly zone, which is all about our sales and operations execution, or S&OE. So that wraps up this S&OP journey, and I will now hand over to my colleague Hans van der Drift, who will talk a bit more about the essentials of S&OP initiatives and what to think about.
Okay, thank you. We're using the same laptop, so therefore you see some movement on the screen maybe at the moment. So thanks, Evelien, for introducing. By the way, if there are any questions, then you can put them in the chat or remarks so we can address them either at the end or maybe even right in between. My name, by the way, is Hans van der Drift, one of the partners at Involvation. I think most of you will probably know us, but I can't really see who's joining at the moment. So maybe 2 sentences to introduce Involvation. We specialize supply chain management, specifically S&OP and IBP. And therefore always on the lookout for creative ways to implement S&OP and IBP, to improve those processes, and therefore also developing tools that are maybe a bit less supply chainy and a bit more marketing and creative that also involve and get the buy-in of the other functions. And the role of the submap map really goes all the way back to the why and getting the willingness improved by maybe even jointly setting up these subway maps. So it can also make it a bit of fun, and also for them to really think about. So what's my position? What's my role in this overall process? Because if you probably work in supply chain, I'm sure you'll all have the overview and it's all crystal clear where you fit in. But if you work in other functions, well, some companies, other functions are very much involved. But sometimes you also find that that's not the case, and therefore we are looking for ways to get them involved and to, in one sort of glance, show how how their role fits and how it all hangs together, all the way down to here the top left-hand corner with the S&OP area, where it all becomes a bit more operational and tangible. So this is really where the subway map fits in to basically in any sort of S&OP related initiative. So let's park it for a second. What I'd like to do now is to also take another analogy of this submap web, where we basically use it as a journey. And Evelien was already started to explain that. I mean, our first question in any S&OP project, whatever it entails, is always, I mean, why? And what do you want to do? So on the top right-hand corner, what's your ambition? That's really where it all starts. Because if that's not clear, we can make fantastic tools and super processes, and we can select very fancy tools with AI and ML, etc. But if the ambition isn't clear and the business drivers haven't really been specified, then obviously, I mean, why are people going to be investing time and money and energy to make this into a success? It's not going to work. So that question stays there all the time and has to be spelled out. So that's one. But then, of course, it's a journey, because if you know where you're going to go, then I mean, it's always also important to understand very clearly where you stand today. And that's basically after the why question. The next question is, so what are you doing today? What's missing? And where do you stand today in terms of I mean, any aspect that is important for S&OP? And then obviously the objective of that is to then be able to define where you are in a network and what route you are going to have to travel to get to that ambition. So defining the starting point next to defining the ambition is really an important step in any S&OP journey. So let's make that a little bit more specific, because defining the starting point sounds quite straightforward, and I don't think we should overcomplicate it, but we also shouldn't sort of downplay it, because by defining the starting point and the ambition, we really want to be very clear what exactly the journey is that we're going to make. And therefore, we have defined an assessment approach, which is one of the services that we would like to also bring into this session. And those assessments use a number of reference models that I'm sure you're quite familiar with. In the blue table at the top, you see the famous Gardner maturity levels, where you move all the way from basically just reactive firefighting all the way down to strategic alignment, and you extend the supply chain with all the suppliers and customers involved, etc. And when we do an assessment, that model obviously plays a role. So where do you sit today? Are you really still stage 1 or stage 2? Or are you maybe even further down the road already? So that is one of the reference models that we use. The second one, and there's a lot of detail behind this that I'm not going to present and go into in this session, obviously. But you can see the radar chart here as an example, where the basis really is the change model that Evelien presented at the beginning, where the outcome on top is really the why. So what is driving this? But outcome in this case, again in more detail, spells out what exactly this process is going to contribute. I mean, how is it going to improve your business, and which KPIs is S&OP or IBP going to improve? And this one is, and we can keep on stressing that, is essential, because if we don't define very clearly this outcome, also even quantify it, then how do we ever know that it is a success? If people think it's a success or whatever. So we try to make that as tangible as possible. And obviously, in the assessment, in the as-is assessment, we do the zero measurement. So where do you stand today? Because otherwise, we will never know whether we will make an improvement. You also see a topic called organization, and this is in fact where the willingness sits, and also where the capability sits in the change model. So that even though in this chart you only see one aspect, really there's quite an extensive world behind, where we focus on basically two sub aspects. One is the competencies. So really, do people have the right I don't know, the leadership skills or the analytical skills. Let's say generic competencies. And we look at skills basically the skills that you can that if they are missing, we could train. So outcome and organization, two important aspects that come straight out from the change model. And then basically we split the logic into 4 specific areas, because even though they are not more important than the others two, but there are more aspects to it. So we need to look at the process. What does it look like? We look at the metrics that you're using. So which KPIs are you basically tracking? What do your dashboards look like? What's your planning horizon? That's really related to the Gartner model, obviously. And then also linked to the subject of today, technology and data. In the assessment, we will look at, of course, your platforms, but even before that, I mean, what data and what information is required to support the process that you run today to get to the outcome that you're looking for. So in the assessment, and again, there's lots and lots of detail behind, we really go through a very systematic way of assessing all those aspects in the Gartner model, in the change model, plotted in the radar chart with the analysis behind, in the as-is. And then obviously, we also translate your ambition along the same axis. And then the objective obviously is to identify the gap. Now, why is that gap important? I mean, I guess it's obvious, but I'm still going to spell it out. Is once we know the gap, we then have a very good basis to define basically the whole program that will be required to get from A to B. And so to get from your starting station in the subway map all the way down to the station where you want to go. So the assessment is quite an important aspect. In case of let's say a single unit entity, this can be relatively straightforward, and we just need to make sure that we cover all the aspects. The moment you have more than one entity, for example, more business units or more country organizations or multiple whatever, so your organization is more complex, then of course consistency also comes into the picture, where we really start to use or to define the standard checklists that you can use across those BUs to make sure that we get a consistent picture across all those sub-organizations. Because then the starting point may not be only one starting point, but you might have multiple, where some of the countries or units are quite advanced already, and some of the units are maybe still need to take some initial steps to get to the same position. So consistency it can be a very important aspect in case you are a more complex or multinational organization. Okay, so that's really what I'd like to say about assessments. There's one specific area that I'd like to take out specifically, and that is competencies and skills. Not because it is the most important aspect, but because next to the why, it's also one that is sometimes, or in fact quite often, either forgotten or doesn't really get a sufficient focus in our view. And as I said, it really comes down to two specific areas. One is the skills gaps, and skills is really the types of competencies that we believe can be trained. Competencies can mean is more generic, like leadership skills or analytical skills or whatever, something more difficult to be trained. And that has a consequence, because if we assess those abilities, we can basically come to a number of different conclusions. So if there are gaps in those abilities, they will need to be addressed somehow, because as Evelien explained, there are multipliers in between. If ability is 0, well, for the fast mathematicians, if you multiply something by 0, the answer will be 0. So we have to address that. And it can be different things. So it could be coaching, where we really trust that someone will learn and just needs to be helped, taken by the hand, to make sure that we get the process going at the right level of quality. It can also be training. In quite a lot of our S&OP projects, we do quite extensive learning and development programs. One for the participants, but also for the people maybe around and the stakeholders, to make sure that they understand the why, but they also know what steps to take in the process. So that can be addressed by learning and development, so by specific training programs, for example. And in the end, it can also mean, and this is what can happen quite easily when there's a serious competency gap, is that we need to reallocate the roles. And that can sometimes be tough because it means they will never have an impact on people. But again, if that is the case, it's the case. If somebody needs to chair a demand review or a product portfolio review or even an executive S&OP meeting, but doesn't really have the competencies to do that, for whatever reason, then of course the process is, even though it's a fantastic process maybe, it's not going to fly. So we need to address it, and sometimes it will mean that you will have to have tough discussions, and then that's the case. So most cases, fortunately, that's not necessary, and we can solve it by either training, coaching, making sure that people really get into the whole thing. So in the assessments, we address all the aspects. I took out competencies and skills gaps specifically because even though we do not normally do very formal assessments of those, if we find that in the process these are missing or not at the right level, they have to be addressed, and let's not forget that. Okay, so, and then there's one aspect that I'd also like to take out, not because it's, again, not because it's more important than the others, but also because partly it's because it's the topic of today, software selection, making sure that you have the right IT infrastructure, the right solutions and systems to support your process. Because even though everybody will argue that S&OP is not about systems, without systems there will be no S&OP. And as Ariana this morning already explained, if you try and do this in Excel, of course you can get so far. You can get the basic process running, but the moment it gets more advanced, well, then without systems you can't really survive. And I think that very much in line with what Martijn told at his opening speech. There's in the S&OP software world, things are really starting to change. Data and technology are important, have always been important, and I could actually argue that selecting S&OP software, we do quite a lot of projects in this area, has become simpler, but actually also more complex. So there's a bit of a dual thought there, and that means it's simpler because you can't, I think, really do it wrong anymore. So you will never. I mean, most of the, let's say, the current systems in the market, they'll do the job in some shape or form. So the risk of getting it really wrong, selecting a system that's where you really can't work, with, well, of course it's possible, but not so likely. But of course, there have been quite significant changes in terms of technology, and that means that the risk of missing out, or the risk of jumping the gun, so being too new or too advanced for your organization, that risk has actually increased. And I've sort of tried to symbolize that with two types of cars, where you can go for the very safe, very solid, proven technology in the Audi station at the top, and you won't make a mistake. You will have a fantastic job, you'll have a fantastic journey wherever you need to go, and it will be super. But you can also choose for a maybe more innovative solution, pictured at the bottom. That if from the outside, I mean, next to the color, you could argue, well, it's both cars, right? What's the big deal? But in fact, what we find is that under the hood, things have really started to change. Like in the cars, there is, I mean, also with the V6 pictured at the top, of course, things have changed a lot. It's not like we will find the same engine as 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But if you lift the hood of the Tesla, then of course you're going to be a bit surprised, because there's nothing. The world is really starting to change. So even though from the outside, like in the painting that we pictured in the beginning, it looks similar. It's also got 4 wheels. It's also got chairs and a steering wheel. Under the hood, things have really started to change. And although you could argue that modern, let's say, classical systems have started to make huge steps in supporting S&OP and IBP, in terms of volume value conversion, aggregation, disaggregation, scenario planning, etc., that's all really well. But all of a sudden, there's something. There are a number of game changers in the picture as well. From where basically let's say my mental picture that I make myself, that you move from sort of very high structured ERP systems, algorithms that do supply chain planning, a structured business warehouse, to more generic intelligent engines that take lots and lots of data, structured, sometimes unstructured data, and are able to create value from the data in quite a different way than the traditional systems tend to do. And we're not going to go into what it exactly means, but I think it's important to mention that this world is really changing, and a number of the vendors that are present today actually are going to prove this point much better than I can from this in this short presentation. Which means that, and I've put sort of the Tinder symbol in the center here, making the perfect match already was, well, could be quite an effort. But now I would argue that we need to look at more aspects than just functionality. So writing the functional specs, the technical specs, and they need to match, of course, that's all very fine. But now we need to make sure that the maturity of the solution, the complexity of the solution, the people that are going to run it will need to match, also including the vendor, the DNA of the vendor, the type of the business. Next to, let's say, the hard technology and functional requirements, in comparing whether the solutions will cover all your requirements, the number of aspects that we need to look at has increased quite a bit, sometimes a bit more subjective. Although in the end, if we go back to the why, they need to be translated in the end into value that supports the why of your S&OP initiative. So I realize this is quite a high level statement, but the conclusion here is that underneath the hood, things have really started to change, and therefore, even though you can't make big mistakes, you can also really sort of miss the point and also miss a future development or a current development that would actually have been very relevant for your business. Oh, that was too fast. So in summary, if you look at S&OP, and there's nothing new, S&OP has a huge number of aspects. In essence, it's a very straightforward process. It's sort of common sense, really, to sort of balance demand and supply. And if you take it more advanced, we also involve other functions and take it to an end-to-end process. But we also find when we go into the deep, one step more, we find that it's very useful to have those reference models, to have different tools like our new Subway Map, also to create the buy-in and the understanding of other functions, as is assessments, learning and development, change models, selection processes, all are relevant to make sure that in the end you get to a solution that supports the why of your process. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to explain. I see that there are one or two questions in the chat. Can you maybe read them out?
Yeah, sure. There's one question. It's from Timo, and he's asking, how do you see the old wisdom that S&OP is 60% behavior, 30% process, and 10% system?
Well, I think a nice question, and I think all the wisdoms don't tend to go away all that quickly. So I still think that's true. The reason to still, so a period, I think that's still the case. But it doesn't mean the 10%, again, I would sort of almost put the multiplier there again, because if the 10% is 0%, the total will not run. So even though it's maybe not the main aspects, it probably is the aspect that's going to take most of the time and the money, because it's a big investment, it's a big project to get a new platform running, if that is required. So you can't do without. But it's not the reason why S&OP or IVP is difficult to implement. It can be tough to get it going, but I think the more difficult part, dependent on the company, will be to make sure that we get the buy-in and everybody involved consistently over the years. But let's not downplay it. And I think the one thing that has changed, that's maybe good to stress, is that yes, platforms were always important, but at the moment there's also sort of a technology push that doesn't really come from your functional requirements, but that you don't want to miss. So I think it's a bit more two-sided than it was in the past that you basically based this question on. I hope that answered your question. I don't think you can confirm that, but I think there's a second question, or
No.
Okay, so that was it.
Yeah, that was it.
Okay, so I think we've also reached the half-hour slot. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I understand it is really a high-level overview, but obviously we are very happy to meet you face-to-face or in our lobby in the rest of the day. Thank you very much, and hope to talk to you later today.
Thank you.